Picture this. You're scrolling through Instagram at 2 a.m., complaining about your Wi-Fi being slow, when suddenly you're transported to a medieval monastery where the most exciting thing that happens all week is someone accidentally dropping their wooden spoon during silent breakfast. No coffee, no Netflix, no toilet paper, just you, a scratchy wool robe, and the delightful knowledge that you'll be waking up at 2 a.m. anyway, not for social media, but for mandatory prayer in a freezing stone chapel. Think your life is hard? Let me tell you about Brother Benedict's daily routine. If you're already questioning your life choices, hit that subscribe button, because we're about to dive into a world that makes your worst Monday look like a spa day. So, you think you want to escape modern life? Fed up with notifications, deadlines, and the crushing weight of existential dread that comes with choosing between 17 different types of oat milk at the grocery store? Well, congratulations, you've just volunteered for the ultimate digital detox. Welcome to the medieval monastery, where the only thing getting updated is your understanding of human suffering. Let's start with the basics. You've just knocked on the heavy wooden door of St. Wulfstan's Abbey, somewhere in England, circa 1250 AD. The year when people thought bathing was suspicious, medicine involved leeches, and the most advanced technology was a water wheel that occasionally worked. Brother Aldrich opens the door, takes one look at your soft, modern hands, and your confused expression, and probably wonders if God is testing his patience again. But here's the thing. You can't just waltz into a monastery like it's a wellness retreat in Tulum. Medieval monasteries didn't accept walk-ins with commitment issues. These places required a novitiate period. Essentially a trial run where the monks figured out if you were genuinely called by God or just having a particularly dramatic quarter-life crisis. Think of it as the world's longest job interview. Except the position is lifetime dedication to poverty, chastity, and obedience, and the benefits package includes eternal salvation, and all the gruel you can stomach. The rule of Saint Benedict, not to be confused with Benedict Cumberbatch, though both have their devoted followers, governed monastic life with the precision of a Swiss watch, if Swiss watches were made of parchment and enforced by the fear of divine punishment. This wasn't some loose guideline you could interpret creatively. This was law, divine law. The kind that didn't come with loopholes or a customer service department. Your first shock would come during the orientation, which didn't exist because medieval people didn't believe in easing you into anything. One day you're sleeping until noon. The next you're discovering that monks divide their day into 8 prayer services called the Divine Office. Matins at 2 a.m., Lauds at dawn, Prime at 6 a.m., Terce at 9 a.m., Sext at noon, None at 3 p.m., Vespers at sunset, and Compline before bed. It's like having 8 meetings a day that you can't skip, reschedule, or attend virtually, and the boss is literally omniscient. But wait, it gets better. Between these prayer sessions, you'd be working. Not the kind of work where you can take a coffee break and check your phone, actual manual labor, copying manuscripts by hand until your fingers cramped, tending gardens in weather that makes Seattle look tropical. Or, my personal favorite, the scriptorium duty where one wrong letter could doom your soul to purgatory. Imagine the pressure of knowing that God is literally looking over your shoulder, while you're trying to remember how to spell Alleluia in Latin. The food situation alone would send most of us running back to civilization. Forget about your artisanal sourdough and fair trade coffee. Breakfast was bread and weak ale. Yes, ale for breakfast. Because water was more dangerous than alcohol in medieval times. Lunch might feature some vegetables if the garden cooperated. Maybe some cheese if you were lucky. Dinner was the day's main event. More bread, perhaps some pottage. A gruel-like stew that made oatmeal look gourmet. And on feast days, maybe twice a month. Actual meat. But here's the kicker. They ate in complete silence while someone read aloud from religious text. Try enjoying your meal while Brother Thomas dramatically recites the Book of Revelation. The sleeping arrangements would make a hostel dormitory look like the Ritz. You'd share a long, drafty hall with dozens of other monks, sleeping on a straw mattress that was probably older than some of the younger brothers. No privacy, no personal space, and definitely no climate control. The stones that made these buildings so impressively permanent also made them incredibly effective at storing cold and releasing it slowly throughout the night. It's like sleeping in a medieval refrigerator with a religious soundtrack. And speaking of privacy, forget everything you know about personal time. Medieval monasteries operated on the principle that idle hands were the devil's workshop, so every moment was accounted for. Prayer, work, study, more prayer, more work. The concept of me time was not just foreign, It was probably heretical. Want to take a long shower to decompress? Hope you enjoy cold water from a communal wash basin, and make it quick because Brother Marcus needs to use it too. The clothes situation deserves special mention. You'd be wearing the same rough wool habit every day. A garment designed for durability and humility, not comfort or style. Think of the itchiest sweater you've ever worn. Now imagine it covering your entire body and never taking it off. The monks believed that physical discomfort helped purify the soul, which is a philosophical way of saying they turned suffering into a virtue out of necessity. Personal possessions? What personal possessions? You'd own nothing except your habit, a prayer book, maybe a simple wooden cross. No iPhone to doom scroll through social media, no books for pleasure reading, no snacks hidden in your nightstand. The monastery provided everything you needed for survival and spiritual development, which apparently didn't include anything that made life particularly enjoyable. But perhaps the most challenging aspect for modern people would be the complete restructuring of how you think about time, purpose, and individual identity. Medieval monks weren't trying to find themselves, they were trying to lose themselves in service to God. The very concept of personal fulfillment or following your passion would be incomprehensible. Your job wasn't to be happy, it was to be holy. Let that sink in for a moment. In a world where we're constantly told to optimize our lives for happiness and personal achievement, imagine choosing a path where personal desires were not just secondary, they were obstacles to overcome. Now that you've accepted your fate, and Brother Aldrich has reluctantly let you pass the threshold, let's talk about your new home. Medieval monasteries weren't just buildings, they were carefully designed machines for spiritual transformation. And by transformation, I mean they were engineered to make you as uncomfortable as possible while keeping you alive enough to pray. The first thing you'd notice is the cold. Not the kind of cold you fix with a thermostat adjustment, but the bone-deep, soul-penetrating cold that makes you understand why medieval people thought hell might actually be a frozen wasteland. These stone walls, impressive as they are, have the thermal efficiency of a colander. The monks built them thick for defense and permanence, not comfort. Walking through the corridors in winter was like navigating a beautifully crafted icebox designed by someone who thought suffering built character. The cloister, that peaceful-looking covered walkway surrounding the central garden, becomes your highway to hypothermia. 4 sides of drafty stone arches where you'd walk daily for exercise and contemplation. Sounds serene, doesn't it? Now picture it in January, with wind whipping through those elegant openings, carrying the kind of dampness that seeps into your bones and stays there until spring. The garden in the center, lovely in summer, becomes a frozen wasteland that serves as a constant reminder of life's temporary nature. Your cell, and yes, they called it a cell, which should tell you everything about medieval monastic marketing, was a masterpiece of minimalism. Think of the smallest hotel room you've ever stayed in. Remove everything that made it habitable. Add some spiritual decorations, and you're halfway there. A wooden plank bed with a straw mattress that had seen better decades. A small wooden cross on the wall. Maybe a tiny window if you were lucky, and enough space to kneel for prayer. The window, if present, had no glass, because glass was for rich people, and churches, not for monks who were supposed to be embracing poverty. But let's talk about the real architectural marvel, the latrines. Medieval monastery bathrooms were communal affairs that would make modern germaphobes weep. Picture a long stone bench with multiple holes cut into it, positioned over a channel that hopefully carried waste away from the living areas. No privacy screens, no toilet paper, no running water for washing, just you, your fellow monks, and a shared understanding that bodily functions were another opportunity for humility. The smell alone would reset your entire relationship with the concept of air quality. The refectory, the dining hall, was a study in acoustic torture disguised as community dining. Long wooden tables and benches, in a stone room specifically designed to amplify every sound. The scrape of wooden spoons on wooden bowls, the shuffle of sandaled feet on stone floors, the occasional cough that echoed like thunder. Remember, you're eating in complete silence while someone reads aloud, so every tiny noise becomes magnified. Try enjoying your pottage while hyper-conscious that your chewing might disturb Brother Francis's contemplation of eternal damnation. The scriptorium, where much of your daily work would happen, deserves special attention because it represents medieval multitasking at its finest, being cold, uncomfortable, and intellectually challenged simultaneously. Imagine a library designed by someone who thought comfort was the enemy of concentration. Stone desks, wooden stools with no back support, windows positioned to provide light, but not warmth. You'd spend hours hunched over parchment, carefully copying texts in conditions that would make modern office workers file workers' compensation claims. The ink you'd use was made from oak galls and iron, creating a permanent but slow-drying medium that punished impatience. Make an error, and you couldn't just hit backspace, you'd have to scrape the parchment with a knife and start over, assuming the parchment survived the process. The quill pens required constant maintenance, cutting new nibs throughout the day, and the books you were copying, heavy leather-bound volumes that needed to be handled with reverence because replacing them would take months of work. But perhaps the most psychologically challenging architectural feature was the bell tower. That beautiful stone spire wasn't just decorative. It housed the instrument of your temporal doom, the bells that called you to prayer 8 times a day, every day for the rest of your natural life. These weren't gentle chimes, they were bronze declarations of divine authority that could be heard for miles. You couldn't ignore them, you couldn't sleep through them, and you definitely couldn't put them on silent mode. The kitchen area would shock modern sensibilities in ways that go beyond mere inconvenience. Cooking happened over open fires in massive stone hearths that filled the room with smoke. No ventilation systems, no temperature controls, no refrigeration. Food preservation relied on salt, smoke, and prayer. The enormous wooden tables where food was prepared had seen generations of use and probably harbored bacteria that wouldn't be discovered for another 600 years. But hey, at least the cooking fires provided some warmth, assuming you didn't mind the risk of setting your wool habit ablaze. The infirmary, where sick monks were treated, operated on medical principles that would terrify modern patients. Bloodletting equipment, herbal remedies based more on superstition than science, and the firm belief that illness was often a spiritual issue requiring prayer more than medicine. Getting sick in a medieval monastery wasn't just physically dangerous. It was a theological crisis that might indicate insufficient faith or hidden sin. Storage areas throughout the monastery reveal the constant struggle against decay and pests. Grain stores with elaborate systems to keep out mice and rats. Wine cellars where the monastery's won luxury aged in wooden barrels. Libraries where precious manuscripts battled humidity, insects, and the occasional flood. Every aspect of monastic life involved maintaining civilization's treasures against nature's constant attempts to reclaim them. The workshops, blacksmith, carpentry, weaving operated with tools and techniques that would challenge even skilled craftspeople today. No power tools, no precision instruments, just human skill, basic tools, and the patience of saints. Literally, look around your current living situation and appreciate the miracle of modern climate control, plumbing, and architectural comfort. Medieval monasteries were built for eternity, not comfort, and you'd feel every stone of that eternal commitment in your bones. Time for the reality check that would shatter your romanticized notions about peaceful monastic life. The daily schedule. You thought your morning routine was rough? Let me introduce you to a lifestyle that makes military boot camp look like a luxury vacation. Your day begins at 2 a.m., not 2:05 a.m., because you hit snooze, not 2:15 a.m., because you needed just 5 more minutes. 2 a.m. sharp, when the bell tower announces matins, with all the subtlety of a medieval alarm clock designed by someone who hated sleep. In the pitch-black darkness of your dormitory, you'd fumble for your sandals while Brother Thomas next to you somehow managed to wake up already praying. There's no coffee brewing in the kitchen, no gentle wake-up music, just the immediate expectation that you'll transition from unconsciousness to divine worship in approximately 30 seconds. Matins itself lasted about an hour and a half, 90 minutes of Latin prayers, psalm singing, and readings from scripture, while standing on cold stone floors in a chapel that apparently believed heating was a sign of spiritual weakness. Your breath would form clouds in the air, while you tried to follow along with prayers you'd memorized, but still struggled to pronounce correctly. Make a mistake in Latin, and you weren't just embarrassing yourself, you were potentially offending the Almighty. No pressure. After matins, you didn't go back to bed. Oh no, that would be too reasonable. Instead, you had about an hour for private prayer and contemplation before Lord's at dawn. This was supposedly free time, which in monastic terms meant time to reflect on your sins, prepare spiritually for the day ahead, or catch up on any prayers you'd rushed through the previous day. Think of it as spiritual homework that never ended. Lords brought everyone back together for another round of communal worship. As the sun rose, assuming you could see the sun through those narrow windows, more standing, more Latin, more singing in harmony with monks whose voices ranged from angelic to sounds that would make dogs howl. The acoustics in medieval chapels were designed to carry sacred music, which meant they also perfectly amplified Brother Benedict's unfortunate tendency to sing slightly off-key. Prime at 6 a.m. was mercifully shorter, but it led directly into the first work period of the day. No breakfast yet, you'd been awake for 4 hours, and wouldn't eat until after terce at 9 a.m. Your stomach would be growling while you tried to focus on copying manuscripts or tending gardens. But hunger was just another form of spiritual discipline. Modern intermittent fasting has nothing on medieval monastic eating schedules. The work periods were where monastic life revealed its true character. This wasn't busy work or make-believe productivity. Monasteries were essentially medieval corporations that needed to be financially self-sufficient. You might spend your morning hours in the scriptorium, hunched over a manuscript, carefully forming letters with a quill pen while your hand cramped and your back ached. One smudge, one poorly formed letter, one moment of inattention, and hours of work could be ruined. The manuscripts you were copying weren't just books, they were repositories of human knowledge, and you were personally responsible for preserving civilization one painstaking letter at a time. Alternatively, you might be assigned to agricultural work, which sounds peaceful until you remember that medieval farming was back-breaking labor performed with tools that would look primitive to modern gardeners. Digging, planting, weeding, harvesting, all done by hand, in all weather, with the constant awareness that crop failure meant hunger for the entire community. No pressure, but everyone's survival literally depended on your ability to grow food in soil that had been worked for centuries without the benefit of modern fertilizers or pest control. Terce at 9 a.m. finally brought breakfast. If you could call bread and weak ale a proper breakfast. The meal was eaten in complete silence in the refectory while one monk read aloud from religious texts. Imagine trying to enjoy your food while Brother Marcus dramatically recited descriptions of martyrdom or the torments of hell. The silence rule meant you couldn't ask someone to pass the salt, couldn't comment on the weather, couldn't even complain about the quality of the ale. You ate, you listened, you contemplated your mortality. The pattern continued throughout the day. Sext at noon interrupted whatever work you were doing for more prayers, then back to work until none at 3 p.m. Each prayer service required dropping whatever task you were performing, walking to the chapel, participating in worship, then returning to work and trying to remember where you'd left off. It's like having your workday interrupted by mandatory meetings 8 times a day, except the meetings were with God and skipping them was literally a sin. Dinner, the day's main meal, came after Vespers at sunset. This might include some vegetables from the monastery garden, perhaps some cheese, and on special occasions, maybe twice a month, actual meat. The portions were calculated to provide sustenance without encouraging the sin of gluttony. Medieval monks had figured out calorie restriction centuries before it became a longevity trend, though their motivation was spiritual rather than health-related. Evening brought Compline, the final prayer service, followed by the great silence that lasted until the next morning. From Compline until Matins, speaking was forbidden except in emergencies. No late-night conversations, no whispered complaints about the day's challenges, no social interaction whatsoever. You went to your cell, lay down on your straw mattress, and tried to fall asleep, knowing that in a few short hours, the bell would ring again and the entire cycle would repeat. But here's what would really mess with your modern mind. This schedule never changed. Christmas, Easter, your birthday, the anniversary of your arrival at the monastery, every day followed the same pattern. No weekends, no vacation days, no personal time off. The only variations came during major religious holidays when additional prayers were added to the schedule, making already long days even longer. The psychological impact of this routine would be profound. Your circadian rhythms would be completely disrupted, your social needs entirely subordinated to communal worship, your personal desires systematically ignored in favor of spiritual discipline. Modern people struggle with meditation apps that ask for 10 minutes a day, but medieval monks structured their entire existence around prayer and contemplation. This wasn't just a lifestyle choice, it was a complete reconstruction of human experience around divine worship, and you'd live it every day until you died. Let's address the elephant in the refectory. Medieval monastic cuisine. If you're imagining rustic farm-to-table dining with hearty, wholesome meals prepared by monks who had perfected the art of simple living, prepare yourself for a reality check that would make your worst college cafeteria experience look like a Michelin-starred restaurant. The medieval monastic diet was governed by the rule of Saint Benedict, which had very specific ideas about food. and none of them involved flavor, variety, or what modern people would consider adequate nutrition. The rule explicitly stated that monks should receive sufficient food to maintain health and strength for prayer and work. But sufficient in medieval terms meant something very different from modern expectations. Breakfast was bread and ale. Not artisanal sourdough with craft beer, coarse, dark bread made from whatever grains were available, paired with weak ale that was safer to drink than water, that had roughly the alcohol content of modern kombucha. This meal was eaten quickly and in silence, with no coffee to ease the transition from sleep to consciousness. Imagine starting every day with a hangover prevention strategy from the year 1250. The bread itself deserves special attention, because it would challenge every modern assumption about baked goods. Medieval monastic bread was made from a mixture of grains: wheat if the monastery was prosperous, barley and oats if times were tough, and in desperate periods, whatever could be ground into flour. The result was a dense, chewy product that required serious jaw strength and had the shelf life of granite. Fresh bread was a luxury. Most of what you'd eat was several days old and had achieved the consistency of edible masonry. Dinner, the main meal of the day, typically featured pottage, which was essentially medieval gruel with aspirations. Picture oatmeal's distant, less appetizing ancestor, a thick stew made from grains, vegetables, and occasionally small amounts of meat or fish. The recipe varied based on what was available, which meant you never quite knew what you were eating. Some days it might include turnips and barley, other days cabbage and oats. The consistency ranged from thick soup to edible paste, and the flavor profile can best be described as aggressively bland. Vegetables came primarily from the monastery garden, which sounds pleasant until you realize that medieval horticulture was limited to whatever could survive the climate without modern pest control, fertilizers, or genetic modification. Cabbage, turnips, onions, leeks, and beans were staples, not because they were particularly delicious, but because they were reliable. Fresh vegetables existed only during growing season. The rest of the year featured preserved versions that had been salted, dried, or pickled into submission. Meat was rare and regulated. The rule of Saint Benedict actually prohibited meat from four-footed animals for most monks, making beef and pork off limits except during illness. Fish was allowed, but only when available and affordable. Poultry occasionally appeared on feast days, but these feasts happened perhaps twice a month. When meat did appear, it was usually in small quantities, more like a flavoring agent than a main course. Think of it as accidental vegetarianism enforced by religious law and economic necessity. Dairy products provided some relief from the monotony, assuming the monastery kept animals and had monks skilled in cheese making. The cheese wasn't aged cheddar or artisanal brie. It was basic, functional dairy preservation that turned milk into something that wouldn't spoil immediately. Butter was a luxury that most monasteries couldn't afford regularly, leaving meals with a distinct lack of fat and flavor. The spice situation was dire. Salt was expensive and used primarily for preservation, not seasoning. Herbs from the monastery garden provided the only flavoring, and medieval herb gardens focused more on medicinal properties than culinary enhancement. Your taste buds would gradually reset to appreciate subtle differences in blandness, finding excitement in the discovery of an actual herb leaf in your pottage. Fasting days, and there were many of them, reduced this already minimal diet to even more austere levels. During Lent, Advent, and various other religious observances, the already limited food became even more restricted. No meat, no dairy, smaller portions, and sometimes only one meal per day. Imagine your current relationship with food, then subtract about 70% of everything you enjoy eating. Meal preparation was a communal effort that revealed the complex logistics of feeding dozens of people with medieval technology. The kitchen operated around massive stone hearths where enormous pots bubbled over wood fires. Temperature control meant moving pots closer to or farther from the flames. Timing required experience and intuition rather than thermometers or timers. The smoke from cooking fires filled the kitchen with a haze that would make modern health inspectors weep. Food storage presented constant challenges. No refrigeration meant everything had to be preserved through salting, smoking, drying, or fermenting. Grain stores required elaborate systems to keep out rodents and insects. The monastery's survival depended on successful food preservation, making every meal a small victory against decay and spoilage. The dining experience itself was a masterclass in mindful eating, though not by choice. Meals were eaten in complete silence while one monk read aloud from religious texts. You couldn't ask for seconds, couldn't complain about the food, couldn't even comment on the weather. You ate whatever was placed in front of you, listened to dramatic readings about sin and redemption, and contemplated the temporary nature of earthly pleasures, which wasn't difficult when your earthly pleasures consisted mainly of turnip pottage. Portion control was built into the system, gluttony was a sin, and the monastery calculated food distributions to provide sustenance without encouraging overindulgence. You ate enough to live and work, but rarely enough to feel truly satisfied. Modern portion sizes would have seemed obscenely excessive to medieval monks. The psychological impact of this diet would be profound. Food couldn't be a source of comfort, entertainment, or social bonding. Meals were functional necessities that happened to coincide with spiritual instruction. Your relationship with eating would fundamentally change from pleasure-seeking to pure sustenance. But here's the thing that might surprise you. Many monks lived long, healthy lives on this diet. The combination of regular meals, physical labor, and absence of processed foods created a harsh but effective nutritional framework. They just weren't particularly happy about it. Here's where things get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean economically complicated in ways that would make modern accountants question their career choices. Medieval monasteries operated under a fascinating paradox. They were institutions dedicated to poverty that had to become incredibly wealthy to survive. Welcome to the world's first non-profit organizations, run by people who had taken vows never to personally benefit from their success. The monastery you've joined isn't just a spiritual retreat. It's a medieval corporation with diversified income streams, complex property holdings, and financial obligations that would challenge modern CFOs. The difference is that all the profits go toward maintaining the community and supporting charitable works, while the people actually running the operation live in deliberate poverty. It's like working for a company where success is measured in spiritual rather than material terms, but the bills still need to be paid in actual currency. Land ownership formed the foundation of monastic wealth, and not in the way you might expect. Medieval monasteries accumulated vast estates through donations from wealthy patrons seeking spiritual benefits. Picture medieval crowdfunding. But instead of getting a t-shirt for your donation, you got prayers for your soul and possibly a reduction in purgatory time. Kings, nobles, and wealthy merchants would grant land to monasteries as acts of piety, creating massive agricultural operations that the monks had to manage efficiently or face starvation. Your daily work wasn't just keeping busy, it was contributing to a complex economic engine. The scriptorium, where you copied manuscripts, wasn't just preserving knowledge, it was producing valuable commodities. Hand-copied books were incredibly expensive in an age before printing, and monasteries with skilled scribes could command substantial fees for their work. That illuminated manuscript you spent 3 months copying wasn't just beautiful, it might have been worth more than most people earned in a year. Agricultural production was the monastery's bread and butter, quite literally. Those gardens you'd be tending weren't hobby farms, they were sophisticated agricultural operations that needed to feed the community and generate surplus for trade. The monastery operated mills, managed livestock, and developed innovative farming techniques. Some monasteries became famous for specific products, certain wines, particular breeds of sheep, or specialized crops that commanded premium prices in medieval markets. Manufacturing provided additional income streams that would surprise modern visitors. Monasteries operated blacksmith shops, pottery workshops, textile production, and various craft industries. That time you spent learning to weave wasn't just occupational therapy. You were becoming part of a production system that created goods for regional and international trade. Medieval monasteries were essentially medieval factories with prayer breaks. The financial management required to keep these operations running was staggeringly complex. Monasteries dealt with multiple currencies, international trade, seasonal variations in income, and economic disruptions from wars, plagues, and political upheavals. The monastery treasurer, usually one of the most mathematically gifted brothers, had to balance budgets that included supporting the current community, maintaining buildings, funding charitable works, and building reserves for emergencies. Property management alone would challenge modern real estate professionals. Large monasteries might own dozens of estates scattered across regions, each requiring oversight, maintenance, and optimization. Tenant farmers worked monastic lands under various agreements, paying rent in money, goods, or labor. The monastery needed to maintain relationships with local nobles, navigate complex legal systems, and ensure that distant properties remained productive. But here's where the poverty vow created fascinating tensions. Monks couldn't personally own anything, but they collectively controlled enormous wealth. You could be helping to manage an estate worth millions in modern currency, while owning nothing more than your habit and prayer book. The psychological adjustment to this separation between stewardship and ownership would challenge anyone raised in a capitalist society. Charitable obligations added another layer of complexity to monastic economics. Medieval monasteries were expected to provide hospitality to travelers, care for the sick, and support the local poor. These weren't optional feel-good activities. They were core responsibilities that required significant resources. The monastery operated medieval social services while maintaining its own community and managing its economic enterprises. Record-keeping was essential and elaborate. Monasteries maintained detailed accounts of income, expenses, property holdings, and charitable distributions. These weren't simple ledgers. They were comprehensive business records that tracked everything from grain yields to manuscript sales. Some of these records survive today and provide fascinating insights into medieval economic life. That time you spent learning to write wasn't just about copying religious texts. You might also be recording crop yields or tracking livestock inventories. International connections added global complexity to monastic economics. Monasteries corresponded with communities across Europe, traded goods internationally, and participated in networks that spanned continents. The monastery might be selling wool to Flemish merchants while importing wine from French monasteries and sending money to support communities in the Holy Land. You'd be participating in medieval globalization without leaving your rural monastery. Market fluctuations affected monastic life in ways that would seem familiar to modern investors. Bad harvests meant reduced income and higher food costs. Political upheavals disrupted trade routes and property rights. Economic recessions affected donations and demand for monastic product. The monastery needed financial strategies to weather these variations while maintaining community stability. The irony wasn't lost on medieval people. The most successful monasteries were often the wealthiest institutions in their regions, controlled by men who had renounced personal wealth. Critics complained about rich monasteries, while supporters argued that monastic wealth enabled greater charitable works and cultural preservation. It's a debate that continues today about the proper relationship between religious institutions and material resources. Banking and credit were monastic innovations that shaped medieval commerce. Some monasteries became medieval banks, offering loans, managing investments, and providing financial services. The Knights Templar, technically a monastic order, created one of Europe's first international banking systems. That vow of poverty didn't prevent monks from becoming some of medieval Europe's most sophisticated financial professionals. Seasonal economics governed daily life in ways that would challenge modern people, accustomed to year-round availability of everything. Spring meant planting and optimism. Summer brought intensive labor. Autumn required careful harvest management. And winter meant living off stored resources while planning for the next cycle. Economic success required balancing immediate needs with long-term sustainability. The ultimate goal of all this economic activity wasn't profit maximization. It was community sustainability and charitable service. Every economic decision was theoretically filtered through spiritual priorities, creating a business model that measured success in terms of souls served rather than wealth accumulated. You'd be participating in an economic system that combined medieval capitalism with religious socialism, and somehow made it work for over 1,000 years. Now let's talk about your job description, which would make modern project managers weep with envy. Medieval monks were the ultimate multitaskers, expected to seamlessly transition between spiritual devotion, manual labor, intellectual pursuits, and community management, often within the same hour. Think you're busy juggling work, family, and social media? Try being a scribe, farmer, teacher, and full-time contemplative while maintaining perfect Latin pronunciation and never missing a prayer service. The scriptorium work alone would challenge any modern professional. You'd be copying manuscripts in conditions that would violate every workplace safety regulation ever written, hunched over parchment for hours, using quill pens that required constant maintenance, working with inks that were literally toxic, oak gall and iron, create a permanent but chemically unstable mixture that could damage both parchment and fingers. The lighting came from windows positioned to maximize illumination, while minimizing heat, creating a workspace that was bright enough to see, but cold enough to keep you constantly uncomfortable. But manuscript copying wasn't just mindless transcription. It required multiple specialized skills simultaneously. You needed perfect handwriting in various scripts, knowledge of Latin grammar and spelling, understanding of religious doctrine to catch doctrinal errors, artistic ability for decorative elements, and the mathematical precision to plan page layouts. One mistake could ruin hours of work, and major errors might require starting entire sections over. Imagine being a graphic designer, editor, translator, and quality control inspector all at once. But if you mess up, you've potentially corrupted the word of God. Agricultural work demanded a completely different skill set that had to be developed alongside your intellectual pursuits. Medieval farming required intimate knowledge of soil conditions, weather patterns, plant diseases, and animal husbandry. You'd need to know when to plant, how to rotate crops, which fields needed fertilizing, and how to preserve the harvest. This wasn't hobby gardening. The monastery's survival depended on agricultural success, and crop failure meant hunger for everyone. The seasonal nature of farming created intense periods of labor that coincided with your other responsibilities. Harvest time didn't care that you had manuscripts to finish or that your Latin studies were at a crucial point. When crops were ready, everything else became secondary, and you'd work from dawn to dusk, bringing in grain that would feed the community through winter. Modern people struggle with work-life balance, but medieval monks had to balance spiritual, intellectual, physical, community responsibilities without dropping any of them. Teaching and mentoring added another layer to your responsibilities. Experienced monks were expected to train novices, share specialized skills, and maintain the monastery's institutional knowledge. You might spend mornings copying manuscripts, afternoons working in the gardens, and evenings teaching younger brothers how to read Latin or explaining the finer points of theological doctrine. The teaching wasn't formal classroom instruction. It was apprenticeship-based learning that happened during work activities. Administrative duties would surprise modern visitors with their complexity. Monasteries required extensive record-keeping, correspondence with other communities, management of property and finances, and coordination of community activities. You might be responsible for tracking grain inventories, managing relationships with local nobles, or corresponding with monasteries across Europe. The administrative skills required were substantial: literacy in multiple languages, mathematical competence, legal knowledge, and diplomatic abilities. The rotation of duties meant you couldn't specialize in ways that modern workers expect. One week you might be focused on manuscript work, the next week assigned to kitchen duties, followed by agricultural labor, then administrative tasks. The monastery needed flexibility to handle seasonal demands, community emergencies, and varying workloads. You'd develop competence in multiple areas rather than expertise in one field. Quality standards were unforgiving across all activities. Manuscript errors could corrupt religious texts, agricultural mistakes could cause food shortages, and administrative errors could create legal or financial problems. The margin for error was minimal, and the consequences of mistakes affected the entire community. Modern quality control systems would seem luxurious compared to the personal responsibility medieval monks carried for everything they produced. The integration of work and prayer created unique challenges that would confuse modern professionals. You'd need to transition instantly from contemplative prayer to physical labor, then to intellectual work, then back to prayer, maintaining appropriate mental states for each activity. The bell tower regulated these transitions with mechanical precision, regardless of whether you had finished your current task or felt ready to change activities. Seasonal variations in workload required incredible adaptability. Summer brought intensive agricultural work that extended daily schedules and reduced time for manuscript copying. Winter provided more indoor time but required managing limited resources and maintaining community morale during cold, dark months. Spring demanded preparation for planting while dealing with the physical and psychological challenges of emerging from winter confinement. Emergency situations tested the community's ability to reorganize priorities instantly. Illness outbreaks required some monks to focus on medical care, forcing others to cover their usual responsibilities. Natural disasters could disrupt normal schedules for weeks or months. Political upheavals might require rapid changes in agricultural plans or administrative procedures. The community needed resilience and flexibility that would challenge modern crisis management professionals. The psychological demands of constant multitasking would be profound. Modern research shows that task switching reduces efficiency and increases stress, but medieval monks had no choice but to maintain high performance across multiple domains simultaneously. They developed mental discipline and focus that enabled them to compartmentalize activities and maintain quality standards despite constant transitions. Collaborative work required sophisticated coordination without modern communication tools. Large projects like major building construction, extensive manuscript copying, or complex agricultural operations required multiple monks working together with precise timing and coordination. The communication happened through established procedures, visual cues, and shared understanding developed through years of working together. The learning curve for new monks was steep and unforgiving. Novices had to quickly develop competence in multiple areas, while adjusting to the physical and psychological demands of monastic life. There was no extended training period or gradual introduction to responsibilities. The community's needs required everyone to contribute productively as soon as possible. Modern professionals might admire the variety and meaningfulness of monastic work, but the relentless pace and unforgiving standards would challenge anyone accustomed to specialization, flexible schedules, and performance feedback. Medieval monks were generalists by necessity, maintaining competence in intellectual, physical, and spiritual domains that rarely overlap in modern careers. You'd either develop superhuman time management skills, or collapse under the pressure of trying to be everything to everyone, while maintaining your own spiritual development. Most people today would choose collapse. Welcome to medieval corporate culture, where the org chart was designed by Saint Benedict. Performance reviews were conducted by God, and human resources consisted of prayer and public penance. The monastic hierarchy was a carefully structured system that would make modern management consultants both impressed and horrified, impressed by its efficiency, horrified by its complete disregard for individual preferences and modern concepts of workplace equity. At the top of this spiritual pyramid sat the abbot, a position that combined CEO, spiritual director, judge, and father figure into one overwhelmingly powerful role. The abbot wasn't just the boss. He was considered God's representative on earth within the monastery walls, making his authority absolute and his decisions virtually unquestionable. Modern employees complain about micromanaging supervisors, but imagine having a boss whose word was literally considered divine will and whose approval determined not just your career prospects but your eternal salvation. The abbot's daily responsibilities would challenge any modern executive. He managed the monastery's finances, made personnel decisions, settled disputes, maintained relationships with secular authorities, and somehow found time for his own spiritual development. He was simultaneously running a religious community, a business enterprise, an educational institution, and a charitable organization. The stress levels alone would require modern pharmaceuticals that wouldn't be invented for another 7 centuries. Below the abbot came the prior, essentially the monastery's vice president and heir apparent. The prior handled day-to-day operations, supervised work assignments, and served as the abbot's primary advisor and occasional replacement. This position required diplomatic skills to mediate between the abbot's authority and the monk's needs, plus the administrative competence to keep a complex institution running smoothly. Think of it as being middle management in an organization where both your boss and your subordinates had direct lines to the ultimate authority. The monastery operated through a system of specialized offices that would rival any modern corporation's departmental structure. The cellarer managed finances and supplies, essentially the CFO and supply chain manager combined. This brother controlled food distribution, negotiated with merchants, managed agricultural production, and somehow kept track of everything from grain stores to manuscript materials. The financial pressures were intense, because mistakes could literally starve the community. The sacristan maintained the chapel and organized liturgical services, making him part facilities manager and part event coordinator. For the 8 daily prayer services, he ensured that candles were available, vestments were clean, books were in place, and everything ran smoothly during worship. In a community where prayer services were the primary activity, the sacristan's competence directly affected everyone's spiritual life. The infirmarian served as the monastery's medical officer, treating illness and injury with whatever knowledge and supplies were available. Medieval medicine was part science, part superstition, and part wishful thinking, making this position particularly challenging. The infirmarian had to distinguish between physical ailments, requiring herbal treatments, and spiritual problems requiring prayer, often without much guidance from either medical or theological authorities. The novice master trained new monks, serving as director of human resources and onboarding specialist. He evaluated candidates, designed training programs, and decided who was suitable for monastic life. This position required psychology skills, centuries before psychology became a formal discipline, plus the ability to transform modern laypeople into functioning members of a medieval religious community. But here's where the hierarchy gets interesting. Rank was determined by length of service, not by ability, charisma, or political connections. The brother who had been in the monastery longest held the most senior position among regular monks, regardless of his skills or personality. This created a promotion system based purely on survival, rewarding longevity over performance. Imagine working in an organization where your career advancement depended entirely on outlasting your colleagues. The chapter meetings, regular assemblies where community business was discussed, operated with parliamentary procedures that would seem familiar to modern committee participants. Monks could voice concerns, propose changes, and participate in community decision-making, but always within the framework of absolute abbatial authority. It was democracy with distinctly medieval limitations, where everyone had a voice but only one person had a vote that mattered. Punishment systems reflected the hierarchy's power dynamics in ways that would seem bizarre to modern workers. Public penance for mistakes or rule violations involved acknowledging errors in front of the entire community, accepting symbolic punishments, and demonstrating repentance. Imagine having to apologize to all your co-workers for every workplace mistake and perform community service as restitution. The psychological pressure to conform and avoid public embarrassment must have been intense. The novitiate period served as an extended job interview that tested candidates' suitability for monastic life. Novices occupied the lowest position in the hierarchy, performing menial tasks while learning community rules and developing necessary skills. They could be dismissed at any time for unsuitability, but successful completion of the novitiate meant lifetime job security, assuming they could handle the job requirements. Communication up and down the hierarchy followed formal protocols that reflected medieval concepts of authority and respect. Monks addressed superiors with specific titles and formal language, requested permission for routine activities, and accepted assignments without question or negotiation. The modern concept of pushback or questioning authority would be literally unthinkable. The election of abbots provided the one democratic element in an otherwise hierarchical system. The community voted to select their leader, usually choosing someone who combined spiritual wisdom, administrative competence, and political skills. These elections could be contentious, involving complex negotiations between different factions within the community. Medieval monastic politics were just as complicated as modern workplace dynamics, but with eternal consequences. Conflict resolution within the hierarchy relied heavily on spiritual principles and personal relationships rather than formal procedures. Disputes were settled through prayer, consultation with spiritual authorities, and appeals to religious principles. The abbot served as final arbitrator, but his decisions were expected to reflect divine will rather than personal preference or organizational convenience. Social mobility within the monastery was limited, but possible. Exceptional monks could be appointed to specialized offices, gain recognition for particular skills, or even be selected as abbots of new communities. However, advancement required demonstrating spiritual maturity, administrative competence, and community support, a combination that was difficult to achieve and harder to maintain. The hierarchy created stability and order in communities that might otherwise have devolved into chaos, but it also enforced conformity and discouraged individual initiative in ways that would frustrate modern workers. You'd either thrive under clear expectations and established authority, or chafe against restrictions that limited personal autonomy and creative expression. Welcome to medieval management theory in action. Let's discuss healthcare in your new monastic home, which operated on medical principles that would send modern patients screaming back to their health insurance complaints. Medieval monastery infirmaries were part hospital, part pharmacy, part prayer center, and part experimental laboratory, where the scientific method had yet to be invented and divine intervention was considered the most reliable treatment option. The monastery infirmarian was your healthcare provider, and his medical training consisted primarily of reading ancient texts that mixed legitimate herbal knowledge with therapeutic suggestions that would make modern doctors question their Hippocratic oath. Imagine getting medical advice from someone whose primary diagnostic tool was observing the color and consistency of your bodily fluids, whose pharmaceutical knowledge came from a library that hadn't been updated since the fall of Rome, and who genuinely believed that your illness might be God's way of testing your faith. The herbal garden served as the monastery's pharmacy, stocked with plants that ranged from legitimately useful to completely useless, to actively dangerous. Willow bark for pain relief, actually effective because it contains salicin, the precursor to aspirin digitalis for heart problems, also effective, though potentially lethal in incorrect doses. And then there were the remedies based on the doctrine of signatures, which held that God had marked plants to indicate their medicinal uses, leading to treatments like using yellow flowers for liver problems, because both were yellow. The logic was impeccable by medieval standards, and terrifying by modern ones. Bloodletting was the medieval cure-all that treated everything from headaches to broken bones by removing what physicians believed were excess or corrupted humors from the body. The theory held that illness resulted from imbalances between blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that bleeding patients would restore proper balance. Leeches were applied with scientific precision to specific body parts, creating a medical practice that combined zoology with what we now recognize as systematic weakening of already ill patients. Diagnostic techniques relied heavily on observation, prayer, and guesswork. The infirmarian would examine your complexion, check your pulse, smell your breath, and inspect your urine with an attention to detail that would impress modern laboratory technicians. Unfortunately, the interpretations of these observations were based on medical theories that were fundamentally incorrect. Your pale complexion might be diagnosed as an excess of phlegm requiring warming treatments, when you actually had anemia needing iron supplements that wouldn't be understood for centuries. Pain management consisted primarily of herbal preparations that provided some relief through compounds that modern medicine has validated. Poppy preparations contained natural opiates, willow bark provided salicin, and various mint and herb combinations could ease digestive discomfort. However, dosage was guesswork, purity was questionable, and side effects were often attributed to spiritual rather than chemical causes. Surgical procedures in monastery infirmaries were limited to what could be performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or understanding of infection. Simple wound cleaning, bone setting, and basic surgical repairs were possible, but major operations were usually fatal due to shock, blood loss, or post-operative infection. The monastery's surgical instruments were basic metal tools that were cleaned but not sterilized, creating treatment that often introduced more problems than it solved. Mental health treatment reflected medieval understanding of psychology that combined religious doctrine with folk wisdom in ways that would challenge modern psychiatric principles. Depression was often diagnosed as spiritual crisis requiring prayer and penance rather than medical intervention. Anxiety might be treated with herbal remedies or attributed to demonic influence requiring exorcism. The concept of mental illness as medical condition rather than spiritual failing was centuries away from development. Preventive medicine focused heavily on lifestyle factors that modern medicine has validated, though for different reasons. Regular prayer and meditation reduced stress. Manual labor provided exercise. Simple diets avoided many digestive problems, and community living reduced isolation. Medieval monks accidentally created healthy lifestyle practices through religious discipline rather than medical knowledge. Epidemic management was where monastic medicine both succeeded and failed spectacularly. Monasteries were often the first institutions to implement quarantine procedures, isolation protocols, and community health measures during plague outbreaks. However, their understanding of disease transmission was limited, and their treatments were often counterproductive. They correctly identified the need to separate sick from healthy individuals, but incorrectly attributed disease spread to divine punishment or atmospheric corruption. The pharmacy preparation process was elaborate and time-consuming, requiring monks to cultivate medicinal plants, harvest them at proper times, prepare various extracts and preparations, and maintain supplies of dozens of different remedies. The knowledge required was substantial: which plants to use for which conditions, how to prepare effective extracts, proper storage techniques, and dosage guidelines. Some of this knowledge was accurate and useful. Much of it was based on tradition rather than evidence. Record-keeping in the infirmary was surprisingly detailed, with careful documentation of treatments, outcomes, and patient progress. These records provide modern historians with fascinating insights into medieval medical practices and disease patterns. The infirmarian tracked what worked and what didn't, gradually accumulating practical knowledge that improved treatment effectiveness despite theoretical limitations. Religious healing practices were integrated with medical treatments in ways that reflected medieval understanding of the relationship between body and soul. Prayer was considered essential to healing. not as psychological comfort, but as direct intervention with divine forces that controlled health and illness. Relics were believed to have healing powers, pilgrimages were prescribed as medical treatments, and spiritual counseling was considered necessary for physical recovery. Nutrition therapy was sophisticated within the constraints of available food supplies and nutritional knowledge. The infirmarian understood that certain foods affected health and recovery, prescribing specific diets for different conditions, broths for weakness, easily digestible foods for digestive problems, and special preparations for convalescence. The understanding of nutrition was limited, but practical experience had identified many effective dietary treatments. Patient care in monastery infirmaries emphasized comfort and attention that modern hospitals often struggle to provide. The infirmarian and assistant brothers provided personal care, emotional support, and constant attention to patient needs. Recovery time was considered part of the healing process, rather than an expensive inconvenience, allowing patients to rest and recover at natural pace. The psychological aspects of monastic medical care included elements that modern medicine has rediscovered: the importance of hope, community support, spiritual comfort, and holistic treatment that addressed mental and emotional needs alongside physical symptoms. Medieval monks understood that healing involved more than just treating disease symptoms. You'd either recover through a combination of effective herbal treatments, good nursing care, and natural healing processes, or die with dignity and spiritual comfort. Either way, you'd receive more personal attention than most modern patients, though your chances of survival would depend heavily on what was actually wrong with you. Time to appreciate something you've probably taken for granted your entire life: the ability to read and write. In your medieval monastery, literacy wasn't just a useful skill, it was a sacred responsibility, a rare privilege, and a back-breaking labor that would make modern people grateful for keyboards, spell check, and the printing press. Welcome to the world where every book was a handmade masterpiece, and every literate person was essentially a human photocopier with artistic aspirations. Learning to read in a medieval monastery meant starting with Latin, not your native language, because God apparently preferred Romance languages for official communication. Imagine learning to read by starting with a foreign language that nobody spoke conversationally anymore, using texts that were primarily religious in nature, and written in script styles that would challenge modern calligraphers. Your first reading lessons would involve memorizing prayers, psalms, and religious texts, while simultaneously learning pronunciation, grammar, and meaning. The writing instruments alone would send modern writers into therapy. Quill pens required constant maintenance, cutting new nibs throughout the day, adjusting the tip for different letter styles, and dealing with the frustrating reality that feathers don't naturally want to hold ink. The pens split, clogged, spattered, and wore out rapidly, making writing a constant battle against your tools. Modern complaints about computer keyboards seem laughable, compared to trying to maintain legible handwriting with a bird feather that actively resisted cooperation. Ink preparation was a chemistry project that mixed practicality with potential toxicity. The standard medieval ink combined oak galls, those round growths on oak trees, with iron sulfate and water, creating a mixture that was permanent but corrosive. The ink ate through parchment over time, destroying the very documents it was supposed to preserve. It stained skin, clothes, and anything else it touched with a permanence that made modern permanent markers seem temporary. The ink also required constant stirring to maintain consistency and had to be made fresh regularly because it spoiled. Parchment, your writing surface, came from animal skins that had been scraped, treated, and prepared through processes that would horrify modern environmental activists. Sheep, goat, and calf skin were transformed into writing material through labor-intensive procedures that took weeks and required specialized skills. The resulting parchment was expensive, limited in supply, and had to be reused whenever possible. Mistakes couldn't be easily corrected. Errors required scraping the ink off with a knife and hoping the parchment survived the process. The manuscript copying process itself was meditation, endurance test, and art project combined. Scribes worked hunched over slanted writing desks, in conditions that would violate every modern workplace ergonomic standard. Hours of meticulous copying, maintaining consistent letter formation, proper spacing, and accurate transcription while dealing with aching backs, cramped hands, and eye strain from working by natural light. One moment of inattention could introduce errors that corrupted religious texts for generations. Different script styles required separate training and practice. Ential script for formal religious texts, cursive for everyday documents, and specialized scripts for different purposes and time periods. Each style had specific rules for letter formation, spacing, and aesthetic requirements. Modern people struggle with maintaining legible handwriting for grocery lists, but medieval scribes had to master multiple complex writing systems and switch between them fluidly. Illuminated manuscripts added artistic complexity that transformed books into multimedia productions. Initial letters required detailed drawings, often incorporating intricate patterns, religious imagery, or decorative elements that took days to complete. Gold leaf application, color mixing, and artistic composition skills were necessary alongside writing abilities. Imagine being required to illustrate every document you wrote with professional quality artwork. Abbreviation systems were essential for managing the time and space requirements of hand-copying texts. Medieval scribes developed complex shorthand systems that compressed common words and phrases into symbols that saved space and writing time. However, these abbreviations required memorization and could introduce ambiguity or errors if not executed properly. Modern text message abbreviations seem simple compared to medieval manuscript shorthand. Proofreading and error correction presented challenges that would make modern editors weep. Mistakes in copied texts could propagate through multiple generations of manuscripts, corrupting important works. Scribes had to develop meticulous attention to detail and cross-referencing skills to maintain textual accuracy. Correction techniques included scraping, overwriting, and marginal notes, but significant errors often required recopying entire sections. The preservation challenges were constant and nerve-wracking. Manuscripts were vulnerable to fire, water damage, insect infestation, and simple wear from handling. Libraries required climate control, achieved through building design and seasonal management, to protect collections that represented thousands of hours of human labor. The responsibility for preserving civilization's written knowledge fell on individuals who understood that carelessness could destroy irreplaceable works. Multilingual competence was often necessary because important texts existed in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and various vernacular languages. Scribes might need reading knowledge of multiple languages, understanding of different grammatical systems, and familiarity with various cultural contexts. The intellectual demands were substantial, requiring broad education and continuous learning throughout their careers. The economic value of literacy created complex relationships between intellectual and material considerations. Skilled scribes could command high wages and prestigious positions, but monastic scribes had taken vows of poverty that prevented personal benefit from their valuable skills. The tension between the economic worth of literacy and the spiritual commitment to poverty created interesting psychological dynamics. Collaboration on large projects required coordination that would challenge modern project managers. Major works like complete Bibles or encyclopedic texts needed multiple scribes working together while maintaining consistent style, accuracy, and artistic standards. The logistics of managing materials, work assignments, and quality control across multiple contributors required sophisticated organizational skills. The transition from oral to written culture was happening gradually during the medieval period, creating communities where some knowledge was preserved in books while other information remained in oral tradition. Scribes served as bridges between these different knowledge preservation systems, sometimes being the first to write down oral traditions or translate between spoken and written forms of communication. Innovation within constraints led to creative solutions that advanced both writing technology and artistic expression. Medieval scribes developed new scripts, improved ink formulations, advanced bookbinding techniques, and created artistic styles that influenced design for centuries. The limitations of their tools and materials forced creativity that produced beautiful and functional solutions. Your relationship with written language would be fundamentally different from modern experiences. Every word would represent significant investment of time and materials, making writing precious and deliberate. The physical effort required for writing would make you appreciate the value of information in ways that digital natives cannot comprehend. Reading would become a community activity, with books read aloud and shared among groups, because individual copies were too valuable and rare for personal ownership. Your literacy would make you a guardian of civilization's accumulated knowledge, with the responsibility for preserving and transmitting human learning to future generations. Let's discuss something that modern people fix with a thermostat adjustment, but would become your daily nemesis in medieval monastic life: the weather, specifically how to survive seasons in buildings designed with all the thermal efficiency of a limestone icebox, using heating technology that hadn't progressed much beyond gather around the fire and hope for the best. Welcome to a world where winter wasn't just a season, it was a 6-month endurance test that separated the truly committed from those who missed central heating too much to achieve salvation. Medieval monasteries were architectural marvels of permanence and beauty, but they were also inadvertent experiments in human tolerance for cold that would make modern people question the sanity of our ancestors. Those magnificent stone walls that still inspire awe today were essentially massive thermal batteries that absorbed cold during winter months and radiated it slowly and steadily throughout the living spaces. The thick stones that provided security and durability also guaranteed that once winter cold penetrated the walls, it would linger until spring like an unwelcome houseguest made of ice. Heating systems consisted primarily of fireplaces in common areas, if you were lucky enough to be in a monastery that could afford the luxury of multiple fires. Most individual cells had no heating whatsoever, operating on the theological principle that physical discomfort encouraged spiritual reflection. The main fireplace in the warming room became the community's social center during winter months, where monks gathered during brief breaks to restore feeling to their extremities and remember what warmth felt like. The fuel situation created constant logistical challenges that modern people never consider. Wood had to be cut, seasoned, stored, and carefully rationed throughout the winter months. Running out of firewood wasn't just inconvenient, it could be fatal. The monastery's woodcutting operations required significant labor during summer months to prepare for winter survival. Every piece of wood burned during January had been identified, cut, and stored the previous summer by monks who understood that their winter comfort depended on summer preparation. Clothing technology was limited to natural fibers that provided warmth through layering and wishful thinking. Your woolen habit would become your primary defense against cold, supplemented by whatever additional garments the monastery could provide. Wool was effective when dry but became a soggy, smelly burden when wet, and it took forever to dry in humid medieval conditions. The concept of waterproof clothing was centuries away from invention, making wet weather particularly miserable. Sleeping arrangements during winter nights would test your commitment to monastic life in ways that spiritual challenges couldn't match. Your straw mattress provided minimal insulation from stone floors that radiated cold like medieval air conditioning systems. Multiple monks shared sleeping spaces partly for warmth, creating dormitories where personal space was sacrificed for collective survival. Extra blankets were luxuries that most monasteries couldn't afford in sufficient quantities. Food preservation and preparation became exponentially more difficult during cold months. The monastery's water sources might freeze, requiring ice to be broken daily for cooking and drinking. Food stores had to last through winter months when fresh supplies were unavailable, making meal planning a life or death calculation. Cooking over open fires in drafty kitchens while wearing bulky winter clothing created safety hazards that modern health inspectors would find horrifying. The physiological impact of constant cold exposure would reshape your entire relationship with physical comfort. Your body would gradually adapt to lower temperatures, developing improved circulation and tolerance for conditions that would initially seem unbearable. However, this adaptation came at the cost of increased caloric needs, susceptibility to illness, and chronic discomfort that affected concentration, mood, and spiritual practices. Work productivity during winter months decreased significantly as tasks became more difficult in cold conditions. Manuscript copying required fine motor control that was challenging when your fingers were numb. Agricultural work was limited to essential maintenance and planning activities. The shortened daylight hours compressed work schedules and increased dependence on artificial lighting, which was expensive and provided minimal illumination compared to modern standards. Illness patterns followed seasonal cycles that would be familiar to modern epidemiologists but were mysterious and frightening to medieval communities. Respiratory infections spread rapidly through crowded, poorly ventilated sleeping quarters. Malnutrition during late winter months when food stores dwindled weakened immune systems. The monasteries in Flammarion faced increased patient loads during seasons when medical knowledge was most limited and resources most scarce. Summer brought different but equally challenging weather-related problems. The same stone construction that made winters miserable also created stifling conditions during hot months. Poor ventilation systems meant that indoor temperatures could become oppressive, particularly in work areas like kitchens and blacksmith shops. The combination of heavy woolen clothing and physical labor in hot weather created heat exhaustion risks that were poorly understood and inadequately treated. Seasonal agriculture required precise timing and weather prediction skills that modern farmers supplement with meteorological data and climate-controlled equipment. Medieval monastery farmers relied on traditional knowledge, observation, and prayer to time planting, harvesting, and other critical agricultural activities. Weather disasters could destroy entire seasons of work, creating food shortages that affected the entire community. Water management during various weather conditions required engineering skills and constant maintenance. Drainage systems to handle spring flooding, water collection during dry periods, and ice management during freezing weather all required community effort and seasonal planning. The monastery's survival depended on maintaining water sources through all weather conditions using technology that was primitive by modern standards. Seasonal psychological effects were recognized but poorly understood by medieval communities. The isolation and darkness of winter months affected mood and community dynamics in ways that modern people treat with light therapy and vitamin supplements. Medieval monks addressed seasonal depression through increased prayer, community activities, and the philosophical framework that suffering was spiritually beneficial. Building maintenance became critical during harsh weather periods when structural failures could be life-threatening. Roof repairs couldn't wait for convenient scheduling. Leaks during winter storms required immediate attention regardless of weather conditions. The monastery's structural integrity depended on seasonal maintenance performed by monks who had to brave dangerous conditions to prevent catastrophic damage. Clothing and textile care required seasonal adaptation that would challenge modern people, accustomed to washers, dryers, and climate-controlled storage. Wet clothing took days to dry during humid periods, mildew and mold were constant threats, and seasonal clothing storage had to protect against insects and rodents that could destroy essential winter garments. Weather forecasting relied on traditional knowledge, religious calendars, and observational skills that were sometimes accurate but often unreliable. Planning activities around weather required backup strategies and flexibility that modern people rarely develop because we have accurate forecasts and climate-controlled alternatives. You develop a relationship with weather that was intimate, respectful, and occasionally terrified, understanding that your comfort and survival depended on forces completely beyond human control. Before you start feeling too sorry for yourself about the lack of Wi-Fi in your new medieval home, let's explore the monastery's communication networks, which were surprisingly sophisticated for a world without electricity, internet, or even reliable postal services. Medieval monasteries operated information networks that spanned continents, maintained international relationships, and preserved knowledge across generations, all without smartphones, though the response times were slightly longer than modern Instagram notifications. The monastery's letter-writing system would make modern email seem lightning fast, but also reveal how much more thoughtful communication could be when every word required deliberate effort. Correspondence happened on parchment using handmade ink and quill pens, making every letter a significant investment of time and materials. You couldn't dash off quick messages or send accidental texts. Every communication required careful planning, elegant handwriting, and often artistic flourishes that made letters into minor works of art. The content of monastic correspondence covered topics that would surprise people who assumed medieval monks only discussed theology. Letters between monasteries included agricultural advice, technical innovations, political news, economic information, and personal updates about community members. These communities maintained networks that shared practical knowledge about everything from manuscript illumination techniques to crop rotation strategies, creating medieval professional associations that operated across national boundaries. Message delivery required complex logistics that would challenge modern shipping companies. Letters traveled with merchants, pilgrims, traveling monks, and official messengers along routes that were dangerous, unreliable, and subject to political upheavals. A letter from your monastery in England to a sister community in France might take weeks or months to arrive, assuming it arrived at all. The uncertainty of communication made every received letter precious and required patience that modern people struggle to understand. The monastery's library served as a medieval internet server, storing and sharing information that connected communities across time and space. Manuscript copying wasn't just preservation, it was content distribution, spreading important texts between monasteries and maintaining intellectual networks. When your community copied a manuscript, you were essentially creating backups and sharing files with medieval colleagues who might live hundreds of miles away. News traveled through monastic networks with surprising efficiency considering the technological limitations. Important information, political changes, natural disasters, religious developments spread through interconnected communities faster than official channels could manage. Monasteries served as news aggregators and distribution centers, collecting information from multiple sources and sharing it with their networks. Your community would often know about distant events before local secular authorities received official reports. The guesthouse system created a medieval social network where traveling monks brought information from other communities and carried news to their next destinations. Hospitality wasn't just Christian charity, it was information exchange that kept isolated communities connected to the broader world. Visiting monks shared everything from theological debates to technical innovations, creating personal networks that spanned continents. Chronicle writing turned some monks into medieval journalists and historians, who documented contemporary events alongside traditional religious texts. These chronicles provide modern historians with detailed accounts of medieval life, but they also served as community newspapers that recorded local and international events for future reference. Your monastery might maintain chronicles that combined local agricultural records with accounts of distant political upheavals. The scriptorium operated as a medieval publishing house where texts were commissioned, copied, and distributed according to community needs and external requests. Wealthy patrons might commission specific texts. Other monasteries might request copies of particular works, and the community itself needed various religious and practical texts. The production schedule balanced spiritual obligations with commercial considerations and intellectual interests. Scholarly networks connected monasteries with similar intellectual interests, creating medieval academic conferences through correspondence and manuscript exchange. Theological debates, philosophical discussions, and scholarly research happened through letters and shared texts that circulated between communities. Your monastery might specialize in certain types of knowledge, agricultural techniques, manuscript illumination, or theological studies, and maintain correspondence with communities that shared those interests. The diplomatic functions of monastic correspondence would surprise modern people who think of monasteries as withdrawn from worldly affairs. Abbots often served as advisors to secular rulers, negotiated between conflicting parties, and maintained relationships that crossed political boundaries. Your community might receive visits from nobles seeking advice, merchants requesting letters of recommendation, or political refugees needing sanctuary. Language barriers created interesting communication challenges that monasteries addressed through multilingual competence and translation services. Letters might be written in Latin for formal religious communications, local vernacular languages for practical matters, or specialized languages for specific purposes. The monastery often served as a translation center where documents were converted between languages to facilitate communication across cultural boundaries. Record-keeping within the monastery created internal communication systems that tracked everything from individual spiritual progress to community resource management. The abbot maintained correspondence with various officials within the monastery, coordinating activities and ensuring that information flowed efficiently throughout the community. These internal communications reveal the complex administrative requirements of managing large religious communities. International connections meant that your local monastery was part of global networks that would impress modern multinational corporations. Monastic orders maintained communication across continents, coordinating policies, sharing resources, and supporting new foundations. A decision made at your local monastery might be influenced by developments in communities located in different countries or even different continents. The preservation aspect of monastic communication networks ensured that important information survived political upheavals, natural disasters, and social changes. Multiple copies of important text distributed across networks meant that knowledge could survive even if individual communities were destroyed. Your work copying manuscripts contributed to a backup system that preserved human civilization's accumulated learning. Pilgrimage routes created communication highways, where information traveled with religious travelers who carried news, letters, and personal messages between distant communities. Pilgrims served as medieval postal workers who connected monasteries along their travel routes and brought international perspectives to isolated communities. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life affected communication patterns in ways that modern people rarely consider. Winter weather might interrupt message delivery for months. Spring brought increased travel and communication opportunities. Summer allowed for major correspondence projects, and autumn required preparing for winter isolation. Communication planning had to account for seasonal variations that could completely shut down message delivery. You develop patience for communication delays that would drive modern people insane, but also appreciation for the thoughtfulness and deliberate nature of correspondence that required significant investment in every exchange. Your letters would be crafted as carefully as poetry, because the effort required made careless communication literally wasteful of precious resources. Now let's address the elephant in the chapel. What did medieval monks do for fun? If you're imagining Netflix alternatives or medieval video games, prepare yourself for a reality check that would make watching paint dry seem like an action movie. Entertainment in medieval monasteries was fundamentally different from modern concepts of leisure, operating on principles that combined edification with occasional moments of joy that were carefully regulated to ensure they didn't interfere with spiritual development. Feast day celebrations provided the monastery's primary entertainment programming, though the definition of entertainment required significant adjustment of modern expectations. Major religious holidays brought special meals, extended liturgical celebrations, and occasionally dramatic presentations of religious stories. Christmas, Easter, and saints' feast days offered breaks from routine that included better food, special prayers, and sometimes musical performances. Think of it as medieval event programming, where the entertainment value was secondary to spiritual significance. Music represented the monastery's most sophisticated entertainment medium, though calling it entertainment would probably offend medieval sensibilities. Gregorian chant required skill, practice, and artistic sensibility that created beautiful communal experiences during daily prayer services. Learning to sing polyphonic music, composing new hymns, and developing vocal techniques provided creative outlets that modern musicians would recognize as artistically fulfilling. The monastery's choir was simultaneously worship team, performance group, and artistic collaborative. Reading for pleasure existed within carefully defined theological boundaries that would frustrate modern readers, accustomed to unlimited content choices. Approved texts included religious commentaries, saints' lives, and theological treatises that combined spiritual instruction with narrative elements. The monastery library might contain works that were engaging and educational, but recreational reading in the modern sense. Fiction for pure enjoyment was generally considered incompatible with spiritual discipline. Games were permitted, but heavily regulated according to principles that balanced recreation with spiritual priorities. Chess was acceptable because it developed strategic thinking and required patience, qualities useful for spiritual warfare against sin. Simple board games might be allowed during appropriate times, but gambling was strictly forbidden. Physical games like ball sports were sometimes permitted in moderation, providing exercise while maintaining community bonds. Gardening provided recreational opportunities disguised as necessary labor, allowing monks to develop artistic sensibilities through landscape design and horticultural experimentation. The monastery garden wasn't just functional, it could be beautiful, providing visual pleasure and creative satisfaction through careful planning of colors, textures, and seasonal displays. Working with plants offered therapeutic benefits that modern gardeners would recognize, though medieval monks understood it primarily as stewardship of God's creation. Manuscript illumination combined practical necessity with artistic expression in ways that provided creative satisfaction within productive work. Designing decorative initials, planning page layouts, and executing detailed artistic elements allowed monks to exercise aesthetic sensibilities while serving community needs. The best illuminated manuscripts were essentially medieval graphic design projects that required artistic skill, technical knowledge, and creative vision. Storytelling happened through religious context that provided narrative entertainment, while maintaining spiritual focus. Saints' lives offered adventure stories, miracle accounts provided supernatural elements, and biblical narratives contained drama, conflict, and resolution. The stories were told and retold through various media, sermons, manuscript illustrations, and informal conversations, creating entertainment that was simultaneously edifying and engaging. Conversation during appropriate times and places provided social interaction that modern people would recognize as entertainment, though the topics were carefully regulated. Discussions about theological questions, sharing observations about natural phenomena, and recounting interesting experiences from travels or previous lives could be engaging and intellectually stimulating. However, gossip, complaint, and frivolous conversation were discouraged or forbidden. Seasonal activities provided variety that broke routine monotony, while serving practical purposes. Harvest celebrations, spring planting ceremonies, and winter preparations offered communal activities that combined work with social interaction. These activities provided rhythm and anticipation that made monastic life less monotonous, while maintaining focus on community needs and spiritual significance. Visitors brought entertainment in the form of news, stories, and outside perspectives that connected the monastery to the broader world. Traveling monks, merchants, pilgrims, and official guests provided conversation, updates about distant places, and accounts of interesting experiences. The guest house served as entertainment venue where the community could interact with outsiders and learn about developments beyond their walls. Handicrafts offered creative outlets that combined practical skill development with artistic expression. Woodworking, weaving, metalworking, and other crafts allowed monks to create beautiful objects while developing useful abilities. The satisfaction of making things by hand provided psychological rewards that modern people rediscover through hobby crafts and DIY projects. Natural observation provided entertainment for monks who developed interests in astronomy, weather patterns, animal behavior, and plant life. The monastery's rural location offered opportunities to study natural phenomena that could be fascinating for people with intellectual curiosity. Seasonal changes, astronomical events, and wildlife observations provided ongoing interest and wonder. Intellectual discussions about theology, philosophy, and practical questions offered mental stimulation that would appeal to modern people who enjoy academic debates. The monastery's educated community could engage in sophisticated conversations about complex topics, creating intellectual entertainment that was both challenging and enriching. These discussions happened during work activities, meal times when conversation was permitted, and formal community meetings. Physical labor provided satisfaction and stress relief that modern people seek through exercise and physical activities. The variety of work, agricultural, construction, crafts, and domestic tasks, offered physical challenges and achievements that could be personally fulfilling. Completing major projects like building construction or successful harvests provided accomplishment that was simultaneously practical and emotionally satisfying. Prayer itself could provide experiences that modern people might recognize as meditative or transcendent, offering psychological states that were rewarding and meaningful. The 8 daily prayer services created rhythm and focus that could be spiritually fulfilling, providing purpose and connection that served psychological needs for meaning and community belonging. The monastery's feast days occasionally included dramatic presentations, musical performances, or special activities that were explicitly entertaining while maintaining religious significance. Mystery plays, musical compositions for special occasions, and ceremonial activities provided spectacle and community participation that broke routine while serving spiritual purposes. But here's the crucial difference that would challenge modern entertainment expectations. Medieval monastic recreation was integrated with spiritual development, community building, and productive work in ways that made pure entertainment activity solely for personal pleasure seem selfish and spiritually dangerous. Your fun had to serve higher purposes, be shared with the community, and contribute to spiritual growth. You'd either develop appreciation for subtle pleasures and meaningful activities, or spend your days longing for entertainment that prioritized personal enjoyment over communal spiritual development. Medieval monks found joy in their restricted world, but it required fundamentally different expectations about the purpose and value of recreational time. Let's delve into the sophisticated business relationships that kept your monastery connected to the medieval world economy, while maintaining the fiction that monks had renounced worldly concerns. Medieval monasteries operated complex commercial networks that would impress modern business schools, engaging in international trade, financial services, and economic development, while their inhabitants had taken vows of personal poverty. Welcome to medieval capitalism with a religious twist, where profit motives were disguised as spiritual obligations, and business success was measured in souls saved, rather than margins earned. The monastery's relationship with local nobles created a medieval version of corporate partnerships that balanced spiritual services with economic benefits. Wealthy patrons donated land, money, and resources to the monastery in exchange for prayers, spiritual services, and social prestige. These weren't simple charitable donations. They were sophisticated arrangements that provided mutual benefits while maintaining the appearance of religious devotion. The nobles gained spiritual insurance and social status, while the monastery acquired resources necessary for survival and growth. Agricultural production connected your monastery to regional and international markets through relationships that would challenge modern agricultural corporations. the monastery produced surplus crops, livestock, and specialty products that required marketing, transportation, and sales networks. Monasteries became known for specific products, particular wines, breeds of sheep, or agricultural innovations that commanded premium prices and created brand recognition across medieval Europe. The wool trade represents perhaps the most sophisticated example of monastic business operations, where English monasteries became major players in international commerce. Cistercian monasteries, in particular, developed sheep farming operations that produced high-quality wool exported to Flemish textile manufacturers. The business required managing large flocks, negotiating with international merchants, coordinating transportation across dangerous routes, and handling financial transactions that involved multiple currencies and credit arrangements. Banking and financial services provided by monasteries would surprise modern people who associate monks with otherworldly concerns. Some monastic communities became medieval banks, offering loans, managing investments, and providing financial services to individuals and communities who needed credit. The Knights Templar created one of Europe's first international banking systems, while other monasteries served as local financial institutions that provided credit and investment opportunities. Manuscript production operated as a medieval publishing industry where monasteries competed for commissions from wealthy patrons who wanted specific texts copied, illuminated, or translated. The economics of manuscript production required balancing artistic quality with production efficiency, managing materials costs, and maintaining skilled scribes who could command high wages. Successful scriptoriums developed reputations for particular types of work and could charge premium prices for their services. The hospitality industry provided another revenue stream that connected monasteries to medieval travel and communication networks. The rule of Saint Benedict required providing accommodation for travelers, but this obligation created business opportunities that monasteries developed into profitable operations. Guest houses served merchants, pilgrims, officials, and other travelers who paid for accommodation and meals, creating steady income while fulfilling religious obligations. Technological innovation within monasteries often had commercial applications that provided competitive advantages in various industries. Monasteries developed improved agricultural techniques, innovative manufacturing processes, and technological solutions that could be licensed or sold to secular communities. The famous medieval innovations in water-powered machinery, agricultural equipment, and manufacturing techniques often originated in monastic communities that had both motivation and resources for experimentation. International trade networks connected monasteries across continents through relationships that facilitated commerce, information exchange, and resource sharing. A monastery in England might trade wool for wine from French monasteries, exchange manuscripts with German communities, and coordinate charitable activities with monasteries in the Holy Land. These networks operated like medieval multinational corporations with religious rather than purely commercial objectives. The relationship between monastic vows of poverty and community wealth created interesting theological and practical tensions that required sophisticated rationalization. Individual monks owned nothing, but their communities controlled substantial resources that were used for charitable works, spiritual activities, and community maintenance. The distinction between personal and institutional wealth allowed monasteries to accumulate significant assets while maintaining religious credibility. Intellectual property in the medieval sense involved sharing knowledge and techniques between monastic communities in ways that advanced technological and cultural development. Monasteries freely shared agricultural innovations, manuscript copying techniques, architectural solutions, and other developments that benefited the broader monastic network. This open-source approach to intellectual development accelerated innovation while maintaining community relationships. Charitable obligations required sophisticated resource management that balanced spiritual responsibilities with economic sustainability. Monasteries were expected to support local poor, provide medical care, offer education, and maintain charitable institutions that served broader community needs. These obligations required steady income streams and careful financial planning to ensure that charitable activities didn't bankrupt the community. Labor relations within monastery-controlled properties involved managing relationships with tenant farmers, hired workers, and various craftspeople who worked for monastic enterprises. The monastery needed to balance fair treatment of workers with economic efficiency, maintain production standards while providing reasonable working conditions, and coordinate activities across multiple properties and enterprises. Market analysis and business planning were necessary skills for monastic administrators who had to make decisions about resource allocation, investment priorities, and strategic development. Successful monasteries analyzed market conditions, identified profitable opportunities, and planned long-term strategies that would ensure community sustainability while fulfilling spiritual obligations. The seasonal nature of medieval commerce required financial planning that accounted for irregular income, variable expenses, and unpredictable market conditions. Monasteries had to manage cash flow through agricultural seasons, plan for major expenses like building construction, and maintain reserves for emergencies or economic disruptions. Legal and contractual relationships involved monasteries in complex negotiations that required understanding of secular law, religious obligations, and international regulations. Property acquisitions, trade agreements, and dispute resolution required legal expertise and diplomatic skills that went far beyond spiritual concerns. Quality control and brand management were important considerations for monasteries that developed reputations for specific products or services. Maintaining standards for agricultural products, manuscript work, or hospitality services required attention to detail and consistency that would be familiar to modern brand managers. Competition between monasteries created market dynamics that encouraged innovation, efficiency, and service improvement. Monasteries competed for donations, commissions, and patronage relationships that provided resources necessary for growth and development. This competition encouraged excellence while maintaining cooperative relationships within the broader monastic network. Risk management involved protecting monastery assets against political upheavals, natural disasters, economic disruptions, and other threats that could destroy accumulated wealth. Diversification strategies, insurance arrangements, and contingency planning were necessary for communities that had significant resources to protect. Your role in this economic network would involve contributing labor, skills, and intellectual capacity to enterprises that generated resources for community survival and charitable works. You'd be participating in medieval capitalism while maintaining personal poverty, contributing to business success while renouncing personal benefit from that success. The monastery's economic activities would provide purpose, challenge, and satisfaction that came from meaningful work that served both practical and spiritual objectives. You'd develop business skills and economic understanding while maintaining focus on higher purposes that transcended purely material concerns. As we near the end of our medieval monastery survival guide, let's contemplate the most challenging aspect of monastic life that goes far beyond physical hardships, economic challenges, or social restrictions. The psychological reality of permanent commitment. When you knocked on that monastery door, you weren't signing up for a temporary experience or a gap year of spiritual exploration. You were choosing a lifestyle that would continue until your death, with no exit strategy, no career change options, and no possibility of deciding you'd made a mistake and wanted something different. The concept of lifetime commitment would terrify modern people who struggle with choosing restaurants or committing to annual gym memberships. Medieval monastic vows weren't contracts with termination clauses. They were permanent transformations of identity that legally, socially, and spiritually bound you to the community forever. Once you completed your novitiate and took final vows, you ceased to exist as an individual with personal options and became permanently integrated into the monastic community with all the psychological implications that entailed. The psychological adaptation required to accept permanent commitment would challenge everyone. Raised in cultures that prioritize personal choice, individual fulfillment, and the right to change your mind, modern people assume they can alter their circumstances if they become dissatisfied, change careers, move locations, end relationships, or pursue different goals. Medieval monks had to surrender these assumptions entirely and find satisfaction within constraints that never changed. Identity transformation was more profound than modern people can easily comprehend. You wouldn't just be adopting monastic lifestyle, you'd be permanently abandoning your previous identity, family relationships, personal ambitions, and individual preferences. The person who entered the monastery wouldn't exist anymore. Only the monk would remain, with interests, goals, and identity completely subordinated to community life and spiritual discipline. The community became your permanent family, with all the psychological benefits and challenges that family relationships entail. These weren't colleagues you worked with temporarily. They were people you'd live with, eat with, pray with, and depend on for the rest of your natural life. Personality conflicts, disagreements, and interpersonal tensions couldn't be resolved by changing jobs or moving away. You had to develop conflict resolution skills and emotional maturity that enabled lifelong relationships with people you didn't choose and couldn't avoid. Seasonal cycles took on different psychological significance when you realized they would repeat endlessly without variation or escape. The medieval liturgical calendar would structure your experience for decades, creating psychological rhythm based on religious observances rather than personal milestones. Christmas, Easter, and feast days would become markers of time passing rather than special occasions, and you'd measure your life in repetitions of familiar patterns rather than personal achievements or changes. The absence of personal goals or individual achievement would fundamentally alter psychological motivation in ways that would challenge modern people accustomed to personal development, career advancement, and individual accomplishment. Monastic life required finding satisfaction in communal achievement, spiritual development, and service to others, rather than personal success or recognition. Your identity had to shift from individual performer to community contributor. Aging within the monastery created different psychological challenges than aging in secular society, where people typically accumulate possessions, develop career expertise, and build family relationships over time. Monastic aging meant accepting increasing physical limitations while maintaining the same daily routine, watching younger monks join the community while your own responsibilities remained constant, and facing mortality without the psychological comfort of personal legacy or individual achievement. The intellectual challenges of permanent commitment included accepting limitations on curiosity, exploration, and personal interests that conflicted with monastic obligations. You couldn't pursue intellectual interests that weren't compatible with religious life, couldn't explore philosophical questions that challenged orthodox doctrine, and couldn't develop expertise in areas that weren't useful to the community. Intellectual curiosity had to be channeled within religious boundaries regardless of your personal interests or aptitudes. Emotional regulation became critical for surviving lifetime commitment to circumstances you couldn't change. Medieval monks had to develop psychological resilience, emotional stability, and coping mechanisms that enabled them to find satisfaction within restrictions that would frustrate most modern people. The emotional skills required were sophisticated, managing disappointment without escape options, finding joy within routine, and maintaining hope without external validation or change. The spiritual framework provided psychological structure that made permanent commitment meaningful, rather than simply restrictive. Monks understood their lifetime dedication as service to God, contribution to human salvation, and participation in divine purpose that transcended individual desires. This spiritual context created psychological meaning that justified personal sacrifice, and provided purpose that extended beyond individual satisfaction. Regret management was perhaps the most challenging psychological skill required for monastic life. Everyone makes decisions they later question, but monks couldn't act on those regrets by changing their circumstances. They had to develop mental frameworks for accepting past decisions, finding peace with current circumstances, and maintaining psychological health without the option of external change. The relationship with time changed fundamentally when personal future was predetermined. Modern people live with assumptions about controlling their destiny, pursuing dreams, and creating the future they want. Medieval monks had to find psychological satisfaction in serving purposes they didn't choose, following routines they didn't design, and accepting futures they couldn't alter. Community responsibility created psychological pressure that would challenge modern individuals accustomed to personal autonomy. Your behavior, attitudes, and emotional state affected everyone else in ways that made personal psychology a community concern. You couldn't have private breakdowns, pursue individual interests that disrupted community harmony, or maintain attitudes that negatively affected group morale. The absence of privacy meant that psychological development happened within community observation and influence. Personal growth, emotional struggles, and spiritual development were shared experiences that offered support, but also eliminated the psychological refuge of solitude that modern people use for emotional regulation and identity development. Death preparation became a psychological reality rather than abstract future possibility, as monastic life was understood as preparation for eternal life rather than fulfillment of earthly desires. This perspective required accepting mortality in ways that provided meaning to current sacrifice while maintaining psychological health and community contribution. But here's what might surprise you. Many medieval monks found deep satisfaction and psychological fulfillment within these constraints. The permanent commitment that would terrify modern people provided stability, purpose, and community belonging that created psychological benefits unavailable through individual achievement or personal autonomy. The key to psychological survival was surrendering modern assumptions about individual rights, personal choice, and the necessity of change for happiness. Medieval monks found ways to thrive within permanent limitations by discovering meaning, purpose, and satisfaction that didn't depend on external circumstances or personal control. You'd either develop the psychological resilience and spiritual framework necessary for lifetime commitment, or spend your remaining years in psychological torment that would make physical hardship seem trivial by comparison. So here we are at our final chapter, and if you've been paying attention, you're probably wondering about the exit strategy. Surely there must be some way out of this medieval commitment that doesn't involve death or divine intervention. Well, let me introduce you to the most psychologically challenging aspect of medieval monastic life. There was no escape route that didn't involve scandal, legal complications, or spiritual consequences that would follow you for the rest of your earthly existence and possibly into eternity. Medieval monastic vows weren't lifestyle experiments or temporary commitments. They were legal contracts with God that had binding force in both religious and secular law. Once you completed your novitiate and took final vows, you had legally ceased to exist as an individual with rights to property, marriage, or independent decision-making. The vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience weren't just spiritual commitments. They were legal transformations that couldn't be undone through personal preference or changed circumstances. The few official mechanisms for leaving monastic life involved papal dispensation, essentially getting permission directly from the Pope to break your vows with God. This process required proving that your original vows were invalid due to coercion, insufficient understanding, or canonical irregularities that existed at the time of your commitment. The process was lengthy, expensive, politically complicated, and almost always unsuccessful, unless you had powerful secular or religious connections willing to intervene on your behalf. Apostasy, simply leaving without permission, was legally and spiritually catastrophic in ways that would ruin any chance of normal life in medieval society. Ex-monks were considered oath-breakers who had violated sacred commitments, making them socially unacceptable for marriage, employment, or community membership. They had no legal rights to property or inheritance, couldn't serve as witnesses in legal proceedings, and were essentially social outcasts who had forfeited their place in both religious and secular society. The psychological impact of permanent commitment, without escape options, created mental challenges that would break many modern people who assume they can change their circumstances when they become dissatisfied. Medieval monks had to develop coping mechanisms for dealing with regret, disappointment, frustration, and the basic human desire for change without any possibility of external relief. They couldn't quit their job, end their relationships, move to different locations, or pursue alternative lifestyles when they became unhappy with their circumstances. But here's where medieval psychology might surprise modern observers. Many monks found genuine satisfaction and fulfillment within these seemingly restrictive constraints. The permanent commitment that would terrify modern people provided stability, purpose, and community belonging that created psychological benefits unavailable through constant choice and change. Medieval monks discovered that happiness didn't require unlimited options. It required finding meaning within whatever circumstances they faced. The spiritual framework that supported permanent commitment provided psychological resources that modern people often lack. Monks understood their lifetime dedication as service to divine purpose that transcended individual desires and personal satisfaction. This perspective created meaning that justified personal sacrifice and provided purpose that extended beyond individual fulfillment to cosmic significance. Community support systems helped individuals cope with the psychological challenges of permanent commitment through shared experience, mutual assistance, and collective identity that reduced individual psychological burden. When everyone faced the same constraints and limitations, the community developed cultural resources for managing the emotional challenges that would overwhelm isolated individuals. The routine and predictability that modern people often find boring provided psychological benefits that include reduced anxiety about the future, clear expectations for daily life, and stable social relationships that didn't require constant navigation or renegotiation. Medieval monks knew exactly what their lives would include for the next several decades, which eliminated uncertainty while providing security. The intellectual and spiritual development available within monastic constraints offered personal growth opportunities that were meaningful and fulfilling despite their limitations. Learning to read and write, developing theological knowledge, mastering practical skills, and contributing to community welfare provided achievement and recognition that satisfied human needs for competence and contribution. The absence of competitive pressure and individual achievement anxiety created psychological space for different types of satisfaction that modern people rarely experience. Medieval monks didn't worry about career advancement, financial success, social status, or individual recognition, because these concerns were irrelevant to their life structure. This elimination of competitive stress allowed focus on spiritual development, community contribution, and personal peace that many modern people struggle to achieve, despite unlimited options. However, let's be honest about the psychological casualties of this system. Some monks did experience what modern people would recognize as clinical depression, anxiety disorders, and other mental health challenges that couldn't be treated effectively with medieval medical knowledge. The historical records include accounts of monks who became mentally ill, committed suicide, or attempted to escape their commitments despite the consequences. The gender restrictions of medieval monastic life meant that normal human desires for romantic relationships, sexual expression, and family formation had to be completely suppressed or channeled into spiritual relationships that provided substitute satisfaction. This psychological adjustment was easier for some individuals than others, and the historical record suggests that sexual and romantic frustration created ongoing challenges that some monks never successfully resolved. The intellectual limitations imposed by religious orthodoxy frustrated monks who had curiosity about subjects that were forbidden or discouraged within monastic contexts. Questions about natural philosophy, secular literature, or theological ideas that challenged accepted doctrine had to be suppressed or explored secretly, creating intellectual frustration that couldn't be resolved through open inquiry or academic freedom. But the most remarkable aspect of medieval monastic psychology was the genuine spiritual fulfillment that many monks achieved through permanent commitment to transcendent purpose. Modern people often struggle to find meaning and purpose despite unlimited options for self-expression and personal development. Medieval monks found deep satisfaction through service to divine will that provided psychological benefits unavailable through individual achievement or personal autonomy. The key to understanding medieval monastic success was recognizing that happiness and fulfillment don't require unlimited choice. They require finding meaning within whatever circumstances exist. Medieval monks developed psychological resilience, spiritual depth, and community bonds that created satisfaction despite constraints that would seem intolerable to modern people. Your psychological survival in medieval monastic life would depend on your ability to surrender modern assumptions about individual rights, personal choice, and the necessity of change for happiness. If you could make this psychological transformation, you might discover forms of satisfaction and meaning that are rare in modern life. If you couldn't make this adjustment, you'd spend your remaining years in psychological torment that would make the physical hardship seem trivial by comparison. Medieval monasteries weren't for everyone, but for those who could adapt, they provided community, purpose, and spiritual fulfillment that justified the sacrifices required. The ultimate question isn't whether you could survive medieval monastic life. It's whether you could find meaning and satisfaction within permanent limitations that eliminated most of what modern people consider necessary for happiness. As we approach the end of our journey through medieval monastic life, let's confront the question that's probably been haunting you throughout this entire exploration. Were these monks wasting their lives? From a modern perspective that values individual achievement, personal fulfillment, and material progress, medieval monasticism might seem like an elaborate system for squandering human potential. Brilliant minds copying manuscripts instead of pursuing scientific research, capable administrators managing religious communities instead of building businesses, talented individuals serving spiritual purposes instead of advancing civilization. But perhaps this modern judgment reveals more about our assumptions than about medieval realities. Medieval monks preserved civilization during periods when secular institutions collapsed under political upheaval, economic crisis, and social chaos. While kingdoms rose and fell, while wars devastated populations, while plagues swept across continents, monastic communities maintained libraries, schools, hospitals, and agricultural innovations that kept human knowledge and culture alive through centuries of turbulence. Those manuscripts they copied so painstakingly weren't just religious texts, They were the collected wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome, scientific treatises, philosophical works, and literary masterpieces that would have been permanently lost without monastic preservation efforts. The economic contributions of medieval monasteries were substantial and lasting in ways that modern business achievements rarely match. Monastic communities developed agricultural techniques that fed populations for centuries, created architectural innovations that influenced building design across Europe, and established trade networks that connected distant regions and cultures. The Cistercian monasteries alone transformed European agriculture through systematic improvement of farming methods, land management, and livestock breeding that increased food production for entire regions. The educational institutions that monasteries maintained were often the only sources of literacy and learning available to medieval populations. Monastic schools trained not just future monks but secular clergy, government administrators, and educated laypeople who carried their knowledge into broader society. The intellectual development that happened within monastery walls had effects that extended far beyond religious communities, creating educated populations that could maintain complex societies during periods when formal educational institutions were rare or non-existent. The technological innovations developed within monastic communities often had applications that revolutionized medieval life in ways that paralleled modern technological advancement. Water-powered machinery for grain processing, textile production, and metalworking were often developed or improved within monastic communities that had both resources and motivation for experimentation. The mechanical clocks that regulated medieval urban life were first developed in monasteries that needed precise timing for prayer services. But perhaps the most significant contribution of medieval monasticism was demonstrating that human happiness and fulfillment could be achieved through service to purposes beyond individual achievement and material accumulation. In societies increasingly focused on personal success and individual satisfaction, medieval monks proved that meaning and satisfaction could be found through community service, spiritual development, and dedication to transcendent values that outlasted individual lifespans. The psychological insights developed through monastic experience created understanding of human nature that modern psychology has rediscovered through empirical research. Medieval monks understood that happiness required community relationships, meaningful work, spiritual purpose, and acceptance of circumstances beyond individual control. These insights about human flourishing were gained through centuries of experimentation with lifestyle choices that prioritized community welfare over individual desires. The artistic and cultural achievements that emerged from monastic communities created beauty that continues to inspire people centuries later. Illuminated manuscripts, architectural masterpieces, musical compositions, and literary works produced within monasteries represent some of humanity's greatest cultural achievements. The Gregorian chant, Gothic architecture, and illuminated manuscripts that monks created weren't just religious art. They were cultural innovations that influenced artistic development across Europe. The social services that monasteries provided were often the only support systems available to medieval populations during crises. Hospitals, schools, care for travelers, support for the poor, and assistance during natural disasters were services that monasteries provided systematically when secular institutions were unable or unwilling to address community needs. The charitable works of monastic communities created social safety nets that helped entire populations survive economic and natural disasters. The scientific observations and intellectual inquiry that happened within monasteries laid groundwork for later intellectual development in ways that are often underappreciated. Medieval monks made careful observations of natural phenomena, maintained detailed records of weather patterns and agricultural cycles, and developed theoretical frameworks that contributed to later scientific advancement. Many early scientific developments happened within monastic communities that had both resources and motivation for systematic investigation. But let's also acknowledge the valid criticisms of medieval monastic life that reflect genuine limitations and missed opportunities. Intellectual restrictions imposed by religious orthodoxy did limit scientific inquiry and philosophical exploration in ways that slowed human understanding of natural and social phenomena. The gender restrictions that excluded women from many forms of intellectual and spiritual development represented significant waste of human potential that had lasting negative effects on social development. The economic resources devoted to monastic communities could have been used for other purposes that might have provided greater benefits to broader populations. The labor and resources that went into building elaborate monasteries and supporting contemplative communities might have been more effectively used for practical improvements to general living conditions, technological development, or social infrastructure that would have benefited more people. However, the ultimate evaluation of medieval monastic life depends on how we define waste and value. If human life is primarily valuable for economic production and individual achievement, then medieval monasticism might seem wasteful. But if human life has value through community service, spiritual development, cultural creation and preservation of knowledge and values, then medieval monasticism represents significant achievement and contribution to human civilization. Modern society provides abundant examples of activities that consume enormous resources while producing questionable benefits. Entertainment industries, luxury consumption, competitive sports, and various forms of conspicuous consumption that serve individual pleasure without creating lasting value. Compared to these modern uses of human potential, medieval monastic dedication to preservation of knowledge, community service, and spiritual development seems remarkably practical and valuable. The question isn't whether medieval monks wasted their lives, but whether modern people are making better use of the opportunities and resources available to them. Medieval monks faced limited options and made choices that served purposes beyond individual satisfaction. Modern people have unlimited options but often struggle to find meaning and purpose that justify their existence or create lasting value for future generations. Perhaps the real lesson from medieval monastic life isn't that monks wasted their potential, but that they found ways to create meaning, purpose, and satisfaction within constraints that modern people would find intolerable. They discovered that human flourishing doesn't require unlimited choice or individual achievement. It requires community, purpose, and service to values that extend beyond personal desires. The wisdom of medieval monasticism lies in demonstrating that meaningful life can be constructed within any circumstances, that individual sacrifice can serve larger purposes, and that happiness doesn't depend on external conditions, but on internal acceptance and community commitment. And so we reach the end of our medieval monastery survival guide. Though calling it survival might be generous considering the mortality rates, psychological challenges, and physical hardships we've explored. By now, you've probably reached one of two conclusions. Either you're deeply grateful for modern conveniences like central heating, coffee, and the right to quit your job, or you're strangely attracted to the idea of permanent commitment to something larger than yourself, even if it involves getting up at 2 a.m. for the rest of your natural life. The brutal honesty is that most modern people wouldn't survive a week in a medieval monastery not because we lack physical toughness or spiritual dedication, but because we've been psychologically conditioned to expect choice, comfort, and individual fulfillment in ways that would make monastic life feel like psychological torture. We've built our identities around personal autonomy, career advancement, and the assumption that happiness comes from optimizing our individual circumstances. Medieval monks found happiness by surrendering those assumptions entirely. But before you dismiss medieval monastic life as an outdated relic of humanity's less enlightened past, consider what these communities achieved that modern society continues to struggle with. Genuine community bonding, meaningful work that served purposes beyond individual benefit, sustainable living practices that lasted for centuries, and psychological frameworks for finding satisfaction regardless of external circumstances. These aren't small achievements, and they suggest that medieval monks understood something about human nature that our modern focus on individual optimization might be missing. The physical hardships that would drive modern people to despair, the cold, the simple food, the manual labor, the basic living conditions, were balanced by psychological benefits that many contemporary people desperately seek, but rarely find. Stable relationships, clear purpose, meaningful work, and community belonging that didn't require constant maintenance or renegotiation. Medieval monks traded comfort for meaning, convenience for community, and individual choice for collective purpose. The intellectual life of medieval monasteries, limited as it was by religious orthodoxy and available resources, provided depth and focus that modern people often lack, despite having access to unlimited information. Medieval monks spent years mastering single text, developing expertise through repetition and contemplation, and creating knowledge through careful observation and systematic thinking. Modern people have access to more information than medieval scholars could imagine, but often lack the focus and depth that comes from sustained attention to limited subjects. The work life of medieval monasteries integrated manual labor, intellectual development, and spiritual practice in ways that created holistic human development, rarely available in modern specialized careers. Medieval monks were simultaneously farmers, scholars, artists and contemplatives, developing multiple aspects of human potential rather than optimizing single skills for economic advantage. This integration of different types of work created psychological satisfaction that many modern people seek through hobbies, side projects, and lifestyle optimization. The community life of medieval monasteries provided social connection and mutual support that modern people often struggle to maintain. Despite social media, transportation technology, and communication tools that would seem miraculous to medieval populations, medieval monks created lasting relationships through shared hardship, common purpose, and permanent commitment that modern people rarely experience because our social connections are voluntary and temporary. The spiritual framework that gave meaning to medieval monastic life provided psychological resources for dealing with suffering, uncertainty, and limitations that modern secular frameworks often struggle to address effectively. Medieval monks found purpose in serving divine will, meaning in personal sacrifice, and satisfaction in contributing to eternal rather than temporal goals. These spiritual resources created resilience and hope that enabled them to thrive within circumstances that would defeat people who depend primarily on external conditions for psychological well-being. The seasonal rhythms and cyclical patterns that structured medieval monastic life created psychological stability and predictability that many modern people seek through routines, meditation practices, and lifestyle optimization techniques. Medieval monks lived according to natural cycles and religious calendars that provided rhythm, anticipation, and variation within stable frameworks. This balance between routine and variety created psychological benefits that modern people often struggle to achieve, despite having complete control over their schedules. The absence of consumer choice and material accumulation that would frustrate modern people eliminated psychological stress and decision fatigue that characterize contemporary life. Medieval monks didn't worry about optimizing their purchases, maintaining their possessions, or keeping up with changing fashion and technology. This elimination of consumer pressure created mental space for focus on relationships, spiritual development, and meaningful work that many modern people struggle to maintain despite their material abundance. The permanent commitment that would terrify modern people provided psychological benefits that our culture of unlimited choice and constant change often fails to deliver. Deep relationships that weren't subject to renegotiation, stable identity that wasn't dependent on external validation, and long-term purpose that transcended immediate circumstances. Medieval monks discovered that limitation could be liberating when it eliminated the psychological burden of constant decision-making and self-optimization. But let's not romanticize medieval monastic life, or dismiss the genuine advantages of modern existence. The medical knowledge, technological capabilities, social freedoms, and individual opportunities available to modern people represent real improvements in human welfare that shouldn't be taken for granted. The gender equality, educational access, and economic mobility that modern societies provide create possibilities for human development that medieval people couldn't imagine. The question isn't whether we should return to medieval monasticism, but what lessons from monastic experience might help address the psychological, social, and spiritual challenges that persist in modern life despite material abundance and technological advancement. How can we create community connection in mobile societies? How can we find meaningful work in specialized economies? How can we develop resilience and satisfaction that don't depend on external circumstances? Perhaps the most important lesson from medieval monastic life is that human happiness and fulfillment don't require the conditions that modern people assume are necessary: unlimited choice, individual autonomy, material comfort, and personal optimization. Medieval monks found satisfaction through community service, spiritual purpose, and acceptance of limitations in ways that created psychological benefits unavailable through individual achievement and material accumulation. The final irony is that medieval monks who gave up everything that modern people consider necessary for happiness often achieved the psychological well-being, community connection, and sense of purpose that contemporary people struggle to find, despite having access to unlimited opportunities and resources. So, the next time you're scrolling through social media at 2 a.m. complaining about your internet speed, remember Brother Benedict, who was probably awake at the same hour, but praying in a freezing chapel instead of doom-scrolling through content designed to make him dissatisfied with his perfectly adequate medieval existence. At least his insomnia had eternal significance. If you've made it this far without booking a one-way ticket to the nearest Trappist monastery, you're probably ready for whatever challenges modern life can throw at you. Hit that subscribe button because apparently some habits are harder to break than medieval monastic vows.